It's wonderful to see you all here, and I want to thank you for coming in off the terrace, because I know that couldn't have been easy. It's such a lovely night here on the Wannsee. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Marina Kellen-French lecture entitled Letters Home, which will be delivered by Edmund de Waal. And I have to say, this is our final lecture of the semester, our final in-person event. And I have the sense from this wonderfully full room that I am not the only unabashed admirer of Edmund de Waal here tonight. And I'm happy to admit that I have been looking forward to this evening for quite some time, and I guess I'm not alone. So. First, let me say a word about the Marina Kellen-French Distinguished Visitorship. I'm guessing if you know anything about the American Academy, you know who Marina Kellen-French is. She is a member of our board, a member of the Kellen-Arnold family, whose generous support, very generous support, I should say, has been crucial to making the Academy a possibility, a reality, and making its programming possible. And indeed, we are gathered in a villa that belonged to her family before the Nazis came to power. The Marina Kellen-French Distinguished Visitorship was established in 2012 with the support of the Marina Kellen-French Foundation and the Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen Foundation. Just this April at Gala to celebrate the Academy's 25th anniversary, we honored Marina and her extraordinary lifelong commitment to the arts. And this distinguished visitorship is just another example of that dedication. The visitorship aims to deepen the transatlantic exchange on matters of art and culture through discussions of the very highest quality. Over a dozen leading figures have come to the Academy since then, including the architect David Chipperfield, Daniel Weiss, the former president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and artists such as Ai Weiwei and Olafur Eliasson, among others. And our speaker tonight, Edmund de Waal, absolutely belongs in this excellent company. And indeed, I would say because of his extraordinary accomplishments as a writer, as a ceramicist, and as a scholar, I feel remiss in not inviting him 3 times over, but I had no assurance that he would come that often, so we've just issued one invitation for now. I hardly know where to start. Perhaps it makes sense to say that Edmund is here in Berlin not only because he is the Marina Kellen-French Distinguished Visitor, although most importantly because he is the Marina Kellen-French Distinguished Visitor, but also because he has a new exhibition that he is of his work at the Gallery Max Hetzler in Potsdamer Straße, and I strongly encourage you all, I probably don't need to visit that exhibition, which is beginning tomorrow. He is renowned for his distinctive porcelain vessels, and as someone who works at the intersection of language, objects, and history, his art is often created in response to archives or collections or the history of a particular place. He has exhibited pretty much everywhere you would want to exhibit, including the British Museum, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, the Frick Collection, and many, many other places. As a writer, Edmund is probably best known for his international bestseller, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, which came out in 2010. And I hesitate to describe it since I know most of you have read it. But the book is an extraordinary account of the author's ancestors from the Ephrussi family, a Jewish family from Odessa who were tremendously successful in business and equally devoted to the arts and the culture of their adopted nations in France and in Austria. The book refracts their history, beginning in the 19th century and continuing into the catastrophe of the Nazi years, through a collection of Japanese netsuke, small sculptures that were used to fasten a container, a kind of external pocket, to a man's kimono. The Hare with the Amber Eyes is an extraordinary meditation on memory and loss. It won the Costa Book Prize. It has sold more than 1 million copies in more than 25 languages. And that's a fact that actually gives me a lot of hope. Edmund has also written a history of porcelain entitled The White Road, and his latest book is a luminous work entitled Letters to Camondo, about another Jewish family, and one leader of that family in particular, who embraced French culture and the French state and came to an unspeakable end. It was published in 2021. It was, I would say, one of the best things to happen during the pandemic, and I strongly recommend it. So Edmund has been awarded the Wyndham Campbell Prize for nonfiction by Yale in 2015 for his art, the Noguchi Prize, a basket full of other awards and honorary degrees. In 2021, he became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and in the 2021 birthday honors was named a Commander of the British Empire for his services to art. And let me just say that as an American, that's not supposed to mean anything to me, but I am really impressed. Does that mean you're Sir Edmund? We'll save that for the Q&A. Edmund's talk will last about 40 minutes. It will be followed by an onstage discussion and an audience Q&A. If you're here at the Academy, just raise your hand in the time-honored tradition. If you're joining us by Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform. Edmund, it's a real honor and a pleasure to have you come to the podium.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you for that wildly intimidating and over-the-top introduction. I want to run away as a consequence, but you're locked in for 40 minutes, and you're locked in from that beautiful sight across the water into sunlight. So for 40 minutes, I have a captive audience to try and navigate with you tonight on this very special evening. It's a very great honor to be here. I'm very fond of Marina, and it's a great pleasure to be in this place with you tonight. But for 40 minutes, I want to sort of navigate some of the interstices in my life between making and writing, between the silences of objects, the silences of ownership of objects and the handing on of them, and really to try and sort of unlock some of the spaces around memory and memorial, the kind of agency in the world that objects, I feel, have, and how to sort of amplify those and investigate and explore them. I'm going to do that simply by beginning with this first image, which is a really important image to me, which is of a hammer in my studio, where I've broken up a collection of porcelain objects that have come out of my kiln. Fracture objects are something that I return to. In fact, I often think of Job sitting on his pile of broken potsherds, speaking back to God, surrounded by broken pots, as a kind of moment of clarity for me as a maker of objects. I've been making objects all my life. I started as a child. I was 5 when I started making pots. Throughout my teenage years, I spent all my time in the afternoons learning how to center clay, to pick up a ball of clay and bring it into center of a wheel and make a vessel. And then gradually over the last decades, I'm very old, I've been doing this for a very long time, finding ways of holding the objects, of putting them down in spaces, finding vitrines and shelves and spaces, finding places, this is in my studio in South London, finding ways of holding objects which are intrinsically diasporic, that always move. Objects are always on the move, but how to find places where they can sit. And the studio has various ways of getting in. There are different staircases. But the heart of the studio in many ways is the kilns, the places where I make my objects and bring them into conjunction with fire. Ceramics is at heart an alchemical, metamorphic art. It's art where you make something in one material and then you give it over to the flames. And things go wrong. That's the absolute heart of what I do. It's to bring things together and find out what happens when they're put under pressure. And it doesn't matter whether they're ceramics, whether they're porcelain, this material that I've been living with for decades now, or gold, whether they're objects which I've turned black in the kiln. These are the new black porcelain objects that I've been working with. And invite you to come to see this new exhibition, which is full of black pots. We'll get to that. Perhaps that's something we can talk about later on. But everything starts here. Everything starts at the potter's wheel. And this deeply uncomfortable bench that I've had for 40 years. I'm very tall, and for some reason this bench I've struggled with it for decades and never managed to work out what to do. But I sit there by myself, sometimes with my companion underneath the bench. And this is what I do. I pick up a ball of clay from one side of the wheel, and I make one vessel after another. It's an iterative process. It comes, it goes, it pauses. I do it again. And why does that matter? It matters because actually a vessel, in many ways, is a contained breath. It's something that holds space within it. It doesn't necessarily have to hold any objects, but it holds something, a breath within it. And this idea of the relationship between me as someone who breathes out into the world, and these objects, imperfect objects that I make out of porcelain clay, is very much part of the heart of my life. So that's one whole end of the studio. And then if you go up the other end of the studio, up these stairs, you come up to a library. It's never as tidy as this. This is a completely faux image. It's covered with books. I have no idea why this ersatz photograph is here, because actually it's full of shards, broken things. It's full of books. You can't move for books. And you can't move for broken objects, things that I picked up on my travels. Broken objects speak deeply into history. Broken objects, fragmentary objects, the objects which actually have that extraordinary disjuncture between wholeness and that moment where something has happened, where some hand has let something go, feel to me a profoundly important journey into what it is to be a human being. Again, we'll come back to that. It takes us deeply into archives. It takes us into the places where you find traces of the hand. You find those moments where something has occurred. It can be a moment of beauty, of solace, but it can also be a moment in archives or in the places of great historical memory where things have been erased and effaced. I make things, and then I try and bring them together, try and put them down in the world, try and find spaces where these objects can rest in all these different ways, and then just see how the light works, how the shadows work, how you can move around them, how you can find a space to move amongst objects and let them work with you. Try and find some kind of passage through the day, through time, through light and shadow with you and objects. It can be objects which are held above you. It can be objects which are nearby. And all of this centers on the idea of memory for me. And Daniel's already mentioned a book. I wanted to retell that story tonight. It's very important to me. It's a story that I come back to, because it's really not very far away from me at any moment. Because it's really a story about becoming a person who wants to hold the navigation of memory close, and someone who really wants to try and work out what it is to make a memorial, which is very difficult and difficult territory. And some of you will have read the book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, and you'll know that when I was 17, I ran away from school to Japan to become a potter. And after a very long, hot summer of making pots with very elderly Japanese potters, I ended up in Tokyo, very grimy indeed, with very long hair. It's a long time ago, on the doorstep of my great-uncle, Ignace von der Frussi, Austrian, elderly émigré living in Tokyo. And he opened the door, this elegant man in a beautiful suit with a bow tie and his pocket, gave me a kiss on both cheeks, made me a whiskey sour, 17. Ushered me into a most beautiful drawing room, looking out over Tokyo, and one whole wall of his beautiful apartment he shared with his Japanese partner, Jiro, was a wall, a vitrine of Netsuke, and he waved his arm and said, "There's a story." And decades later, I buried Iggy in a grave in Japan, a Buddhist grave, and the abbot said his prayers, and I said Kaddish for him, and Jiro took me back to their apartment and gave me a letter, and I discovered that I'd inherited this collection of Netsuke. And I brought them back to London, and they sat with me with my young family, and they burned a hole with me. What do I do with them? And I realized I had to tell the story, find out what had happened. And it was a story that I thought would take 6 months, and it took 7 years. My wife is still married to me. It's a huge deal, 7 years with small children. It's a story of a Jewish family, the Afrussi family, that moved from the shtetls to Odessa. This is their 1880. They built this extraordinary house. This is their house, and then there's the banking house, and then there's the other house of theirs on the Potemkin Boulevard. They cornered the market in grain. They were ridiculously, oligarchically, horribly rich. And they sent their children off, like all good Jewish families, to marry good Jewish girls around Europe. They did a Rothschild. And they sent part of the family to Paris and part to Vienna. And the Paris family arrives in the 1860s, and they move to the Rue de Monceau, which is where all the good Jewish families are moving, and they build this beautiful golden house, the Hôtel Efroussi, and the boys do the different things. The first one, the banker, marries the right Jewish girl. The second one is a lover of all good things, which meant that when the book came out in France, I discovered I had enormous French family that I did not know I had. And the third one, Charles Efroussi, friend of Max Liebermann, who used to come here to Wannsee in the 1880s, 1890s, is a beautiful picture here by Bonnet, has nothing to do. He's a lover of art. He buys Medici embroideries. He buys this Medici bed, unpicks M for Medici and puts E for Efroussi, which tells you a little bit about chutzpah. And with his lover, extraordinarily beautiful woman, he buys this collection of Japanese Netsuke. That everyone in his circle is buying Japanese art. He buys there's a wonderful description of him sitting in the back of an antique shop full of Japanese art with his lover buying Japanese art. And he buys this collection to pass around his circle of friends, and his circle of friends are this extraordinary group of people. He buys Renoir. This is in Dammit in Chicago. This is Dammit. This is another of his friends. This is in the Met. And here is Charles at the back of his friend's painting in the top hat. A collector who makes things happen, an animator of conversations, someone who enjoys the connection between objects and people. And so when he buys this painting, and it's from the easel and it's 800 francs, he generously gives 1,000. And then the Tuesday following, this is delivered to the Rue de Monceau with a lovely letter saying, this one has slipped from the bundle over the weekend. And you know the story, but you know the story because it turns up in Proust, because Charles Ephrussy's first secretary who goes up the staircase in the Rue de Monceau is Proust. He encourages Proust to write. And so À la Recherche has Charles Swann, someone who is beloved, who collects art, who collects Japanese art, and Charles are very close, which makes life complicated when you try and write a book. As soon as Proust comes in, it takes an extra 2 years. So you have that for free. And then he grows old and he gets disillusioned and he falls out of love with his collection. And then in 1899, he sends it as a wedding present to the other side of Europe, to Vienna, where the other side of the family, his cousins, first cousins, have decided to do something at larger scale than the Parisians and have built themselves this modest house on the Ringstrasse. This is my father's house. This is the Palais of Ephrussi. It's more gold, more caryatids, more marble. And in the ballroom, the coronation of Esther. This is the only images in Ringstrasse, Vienna, of Jewish life. The destruction of the enemies of Haman, and this is in the ballroom. So it's self-confident Jewish life in the most extraordinary, complex city in Europe, where the Jewish population mingles with populations from all across the Habsburg Empire. And this is the family house of my great-grandfather Victor here, who's getting married in a hurry. He's getting married in a hurry because his elder brother has eloped with their father's mistress. You have to think about that. You also have to think that Freud lives just across the street, round the corner. It's complicated. But Victor, scholarly, you can see this scholarly man, bibliophilic man, is marrying because he has to have heirs. He marries the Baroness from the Palais next door, my great-grandmother Emmy, who is not scholarly, but God, does she dress well. And the Netske end up in their dressing room, which is where the children come in. My grandmother, Iggy, that man we met in Tokyo, they come in as Emmy goes off to offer balls, to dress up. This is her with one of her lovers, Archduke. We don't go there tonight. But this is where the young children, this is them on their carriage on the Orient Express. This is my grandmother, Elizabeth, who I loved, and this is her with her sister. And it's a hugely privileged life, this extraordinary life in cosmopolitan Vienna. This is what they do. This is my grandmother's opera notebook showing that every night they go out to the theatre. Can you read this? This is how we should all be bringing up. This is the shame for me. This is how we should be bringing up our children, with Shakespeare and Schiller and Goethe and Wagner. So this is Bildung. This is how you bring up your children in Vienna. And my grandmother, this scholarly, fierce woman, doesn't want to get married off. She fights to get educated. She's a poet. She writes to Rilke, and Rilke writes back. There's a fantastic correspondence between them. Rilke sends her the sonnets to Orpheus as he's writing them. And she becomes a lawyer. She goes to the University of Vienna across the street, and she escapes. She escapes Vienna. She marries my grandfather. She gets away. And Iggy refuses to become the next Jewish banker. He's gay. He runs away too. He runs away to America, where he becomes, in his words, the worst fashion designer on the east coast of America. And he really, really meant it. He was a man of such gorgeous humor. And this is the place where my grandfather and my grandmother in Vienna, they come back, they bring their children. This is my father and my uncle in their family house. And then you know what happens. And you know that what happens at the Anschluss. You know everything about this. There is no new story to tell about what happens. But writing the book and writing the story of that first night of the Anschluss, when Emmy, my beautiful great-grandmother, is beaten up and my great-grandfather is made to scrub the streets, and then the next day and this is shaming, when the curators from the Kunsthistorisches Museum turn up to choose the pictures from their walls, and the director of the National Library comes to take away my great-grandfather's beautiful books, and they're put on a lorry and disappears into the Ringstrasse and never seen again. And then on, the violence, the stripping away of things, of possessions which become things which become not yours, into citizenship, into everything else that happens. And my grandmother, Elizabeth Fierce, comes back to Vienna, and she gets her parents across the border to Slovakia. She gets a passport for my great-grandfather Victor, who escapes, and Emmy commits suicide. And some people got out and some people didn't. But in 1939, my grandmother, my father, my uncle, and Victor Efrussi, this scholarly man, become refugees. And they end up in England. And my father, who is 95, remembers sitting in a very cold kitchen in Tunbridge Wells, which is the most banal suburban place that everyone is nodding here, in Kent, that you could possibly imagine. And Victor, from memory, reciting Virgil to him, to this young boy, he was 12, my father, lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. I've just moved my father into a care home. He's completely compos mentis, and we were clearing out his house, and he gave me the key to his grandfather's library, which his grandfather had kept on his watch chain all his life. It's somehow the key to the library that's lost is sort of more than I can bear. And Iggy joins the American army. He fights in Normandy, and I find this really moving. He puts Elizabeth, his sister's name, on their jeep as he fights across Europe. But somehow that matters. He knows what he's fighting for, and I must speed up. But after the war, Elizabeth goes back to Vienna, to this ruined city, to this ruined house, and there's nothing left. Except some furniture, she said, that was so ugly, even the Gestapo wouldn't loot it. And in that house, she's given back this collection of objects that she played with as a children. And Iggy, after the war, this deracinated Jewish man who cannot settle in Europe, sees this collection of Netzsche and has nowhere to live in the world. And he says, I'm going to take them home. It's a very extraordinary and strange thing to say. And he decides he's going to take the Netzsche to Japan, a country he's never been into. And these are the documents I find when he's died. These are all the documents which show him going in 1947 to Japan, to this ruined country, where he builds a house. And there in the back, you can see this convivial, lovely man. For Netzsche, he meets my uncle Jiro. Here they are on the Lake of Japan, and together they build a house which has this collection in it. And he opens up the collection like Charles did in Paris, and like Emmy did in Vienna, Iggy does in Tokyo, and he hands them round, which is what he did with me. And when I bury him and I bury Jiro, I'm given that story. What does it mean? It takes me so long to write it. And I write it for my father and for my children to try and stop something happening, to try and stop this fissile dangerous, complicated passing on of trauma. I think that if I can do this, my father will talk about what happened to him. And he does. And if I do it for my children, they don't have to do it for their children in their turn. And I think that's enough. And then I start to get the letters. Because it isn't a small book when it's published. It goes out into the world and it's complicated. And so I have to write back to all the people who write to me. And I have it comes out a kind of rule of thumb that if you're in your 90s, I will write back the same day, in 80s, in a week. And if you're 70s, so you might still be waiting 10 years later for a reply. But it's genuinely complicated because it leads to other things. It leads to the Kunsthistorisches Museum saying, will you work with us? Will you do something? So what do you do in the Theseus Temple on the Ringstrasse, which belongs to the Kunsthistorisches Museum? Well, what I do is to make 2 vitrines with 264 small porcelain objects in it, and I call it Lichtzwang, after the great poem by Paul Celan. Celan haunts so much of my life. Celan, the poet, as you know, of brokenness. His poems are jagged, the language is jagged, the unsettled nature of his poetry matters. So I write the poems on the wall, and it's there in Vienna for 6 months and profoundly disliked by the Viennese critics, which is one of my greatest, happiest moments of my life. And then in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, I'm asked to make an exhibition, and I take that great image of Dürer's called During the Night. You know, that great, extraordinary image of the end of the world where he sees the heavens coming down. He wakes up in the middle of the night. It's the great image of nighttime. And I make an exhibition called During the Night for Vienna, thinking about nighttime in Vienna. And I take, again, it's profoundly disliked, I take images of shadows and broken objects from the collections, the things that have been overlooked, and make one huge vitrine in the exhibition, but make an exhibition which seems to me to talk to the unfinished nature of this museum and its relationship with the systematic erasure and destruction of the Jewish life of Vienna. It's how much agency do you have in the world? How much power do you have? Where do you choose to put that energy in the world? Which takes me here to the ghetto, in Venice, to this strange and difficult place, and a project which took a very long time to do. It's a project that happened in the 2019 Biennale. It happened in 2 places. One in the synagogues, the Canton Scuola in the ghetto, where I brought together a whole series of vitrines, bringing porcelain and gold, 2 of the materials that weren't allowed in the ghetto for hundreds of years, into making a piece called Tehillim, which is the Hebrew for psalm, a piece that you could see out into the corridor, into the waiting place as you went into the synagogue, and then high up in the I've lost my words in the what's it called? The sukkah. Thank you. What an educated, wonderful, warm audience you are. A piece which is now in Jerusalem. So that's one side of it. But the other side, and this is really what I wanted to say, is that I made something which wasn't for looking at, but for something which was being in, which was a library of exile. You remember my description of that taking away, the looting of that library in Vienna. I wanted to make a library that celebrated, a new library, that celebrated the absolute vigor and vitality and necessity for listening to exilic literature, for welcoming the literature of all those who have been forced across borders from Ovid onwards. And the outside of this, I made a pavilion, covered it in porcelain slip, and wrote into the porcelain slip a kind of history of the destruction of libraries, the burning of books, mostly by holy men, I have to say, across the centuries in all cultures. But writing that into the porcelain slip. And this whole structure is going to become the new reading room of the Warburg Library in London when it reopens in September. So this whole structure is going to become a different reading room for a different library of exile. The Warburg we all know and love as that. But inside, there were 4 vitrines based around a kind of Talmudic text, which you could see in, made out of porcelain. But then this is the really cool thing. There were thousands of books. And you could sit and you could find, if you were Latvian or you were Syrian or you came from Eritrea or you came from Myanmar, you could find a book that mattered to you. And it started in Venice, and we had a huge, wonderful project in Venice bringing together scholars and poets and writers and refugees and choreographers and musicians, and it was glorious. It was completely glorious to see people coming into this space, picking up a book, because what you were allowed to do, unlike any other library, was talk in the library, big tick, and the second thing is, if you picked up a book, inside was an ex libris plate. And if the book mattered to you, you wrote your name in the book. And people were deeply moved because they were finding the books that belonged to them in the library. Foolishly, I said that if there were books that people felt should be in the library, I would buy them, which was a very deeply complicated thing, very expensive. But actually, it was wonderful because it allows this animation. Here it moved to Dresden, to the Japanisches Palais, and then it went on to the British Museum. And extraordinarily beautiful. You can see all these books and the sight of people reading. And then right at the end of the project, we worked out that the most popular book with hundreds and hundreds of people writing their names in was Judith Kerr, The Tiger That Came to Tea, the exile from, and that as a book of exile. Isn't that completely and utterly beautiful? Celan had quite a few too, and Mandelstam, and Brodsky, and so on and so on and so on. And then what do you do with a library? You keep it moving until it finds its home. So extraordinarily in 2015, Mosul, this great civic library, was burned by ISIS. And so the books ended up in the rebuilt Bookade International. They are now in Mosul, and they're part of the new library of Mosul. And I find that wonderful that thousands of people have written their names. These books are now in Mosul. And here are the librarians unpacking the books, the crates. And rather wonderfully, the first book that came out was Paul Celan. So Celan in Mosul matters a lot. I'm running out of time, I know that, but am I allowed 5 more minutes? Yeah, okay. Because that's quite cool. But I'm just going to finish by telling you that things aren't finished. Because I had this invitation to go to this extraordinary place in the Rue de Monceau. It's an extraordinary house. It's the Musée Camondo. It's just down the road from the Hôtel Efroussi, the same street, and it's a house that I've known very well for decades. It's an extraordinary collection. You go in and it's full of works of amazing French art, decorative arts, paintings, furniture, books. The collection of Moïse de Camondo, a Jew from Constantinople who arrived at exactly the same year with his family, the Camondo family, another very rich Jewish family that arrived with the Efroussis and built houses near each other. And Moïse does the right thing. He marries the right Jewish girl. This is her as a young girl, Irène, painted by Renoir. Charles Efroussi arranges this whole thing. And this is the house that I've known. It's a family house. This is a house where my family and their family intermarried. But at the top of the house, if you go another way in the house, you find archives. you find in this top floor extraordinary moments of disclosure. You open one cupboard and it's full of trunks from 1938, another from light fittings. You find amazing records and letters and photographs. You find the photographs of the family. This is Moïse and his son Nissim. And the story begins to unfold and unpack. Because what happened was this, that Moïse had put together this extraordinary house and collection for his son Nissim. And Nissim, like all good young Frenchmen, joins up at the beginning of the First War and is shot down and killed in 1917. And this house changes its meaning. Moïse decides to make this house as a memorial to his son, a memorial for the gratitude that his family, the Camondo family, have for France, for this extraordinary assimilated culture in which he's living. And Beatrice, his daughter, he makes this wonderful, this is Nissim's bedroom. He says nothing should be changed in this house, nothing can be brought in, and everything should be preserved exactly as it should be. It should be a memorial that stays put. It should be a palpable presence in Parisian life. And Beatrice, the daughter, who's married to my first cousin, Frussi, decides this is a wonderful thing to do, and they leave, and the house becomes this extraordinary memory place for Nissim. It becomes a museum in 1938. And in 1940, as you know, the Germans walk into Paris, and there begins this slowed separation of the Jewish population of France from their citizenship. The looting begins, the strictures begin, and then finally Beatrice and her daughter and her husband and her son are all rounded up, taken to Drancy, the French concentration camp guarded by French police, as you know, in Paris, and deported to Auschwitz, where they're all murdered. And so this house, the Musée Camondo, a memorial for assimilation, sits untouched in the Rue de Monceau. Untouched because it is no longer a Jewish house, it's a French house. It belongs to the state. So the invitation to work there becomes hugely difficult and necessary for me. So I start to write into porcelain, and I start to put down in the places where Moïse wrote letters, and I put things, objects in some of the places around the house where things moved, where places of connection happened. Some are obvious, some are in the servants' quarters, some are in Nissim's bedroom, high up. Some I open drawers. This is a Sèvres cabinet. I open up a Sèvres cabinet and make a small porcelain box and break up my letters. That first image, I break them up and put them into this Sèvres table. And I put into some of the places where things have been lost, letters in porcelain, high up. I make a work which I just put into the cupboards and close the doors. Not everything that matters has to be seen to matter. It's about witness. And Daniel, you can pick me up on this, but witness doesn't mean it has to be witnessed. And then outside, I make my first benches out of stone. I make a place. You all have stumble stones, Stolpersteine. There's nothing like that in Paris. So I make benches where people can sit, where people can meet and congregate. And you can see just on the very edge here a piece of gold. It's just a kind of reflection of this moment, this transient moment of loss. And I write a book. The project, the writing of the book, they're all one thing. Someone said to me earlier this evening, how do you divide your time? And the answer is, I have no bloody idea how I divide my time, but I seem to end up with books and exhibitions. And finally, and I promise this is finally, years ago, in 2010, I bought this. I bought a broken Meissen dinner service. It belonged to the von Klemperer family, who were friends of the Arnholt family in Dresden and here. They were Jewish bankers and philanthropists and musicians in Dresden, and all their possessions were looted. They were the greatest collectors of Meissen in Germany. And their collection was on a truck going through Dresden in February 1945. And it was destroyed. And after the war, these fragments, these shards of broken porcelain that had been re-fired in the firebombing of Dresden. You can see the flame marks across the porcelain, were put into boxes and forgotten about, like everything that happened to do with restitution for decades. You're nodding out there. And they were restituted to the family in 2009. They gave what they could to museums. And then I saw this broken dinner service. And without telling Sue, my wife, I bought this broken dinner service at auction and then worked with a wonderful Japanese artist, Maiko Tsutsumi. This is showing them in Dresden, to do kintsugi with them, this art of making repair, making damage visible. It's not about repair, it's making the history, the contingency of the history more visible. It's making loss present within an object. This is what we come back to again and again. How can you hold loss and hold memory and hand it on? And this is one way of doing it. And this dinner service is now in Dresden, and one is going to stay in Dresden, one I've just gifted to the Jewish Museum in New York. So it's about people and objects. It's about movement. It's about how you move in and out of spaces. And really, really finally, it can happen in all kinds of ways. And this is, I have a friend in the audience who will understand that I had an invitation from Wayne McGregor, the great choreographer, to work with him on the Chichester Psalms, Bernstein's extraordinary setting in Hebrew of the Psalms. Difficult, painful Psalms, Psalms of rage as well as Psalms of solace. And so I made huge vitrines on stage, and dancers were held in and out and moved in and out into the light and into safety while this extraordinary music happened. And that idea of movement, of the act of remembering, is really what this is all about. And so finally, given that I have this exhibition which begins tomorrow called Letters Home, which is the first time that I've ever made huge black vessels into which I've written Celan and Rilke and Moments and Elegy, huge vessels as big as me. I want to just finish with Jean Amery, who is someone who matters enormously to me. He writes, "I do not have clarity today, and I hope that I never will. Clarification would amount to disposal and settlement of the case, which can then be placed in the files of history. Nothing is resolved. Nothing is settled. No remembering has become mere memory." And that's my difficult, painful ending. Thank you very much indeed.
So that was amazing. I'm pretty speechless. And yet, I'll have to try just a few questions. So, the thing that comes across most powerfully to me is just the profound urgency of remembering in every one of its possible modalities. And I can see the obvious relationship with this extraordinary past that, you inherited. And that's in one dimension, but I'm wondering about the other dimension, which is a present that seems to be one large forgetting. We are looking at the passing of the last few survivors. We have such an amplitude of works that they no longer often, combine to make a corpus. We're divided by all kinds of different ideologies and addictions, if you will. And so I want to know how that motivates you.
Profoundly. I mean, one of the most profound experiences of my life was actually within the library. Was actually making a library where you could have people who had profoundly different experiences of exile, different journeys into a different country, had crossed borders in all kinds of ways, both historically and within the present moment. Had moved generations ago and were holding that, as many of us do, that complicated, unresolved memory, which families have, both Holocaust-era families, but all kinds of families that have been forced to move for all kinds of reasons, and people who had just arrived. And to have a space where people could be near each other within that experience was so extraordinary. So you could have someone who was picking up a Brodsky, or someone who could pick up Mahmoud Darwish, from Palestine, and you could have them in the same space and talking together. So it's this atomization of trauma that says that each traumatic thing that's happened to every family is unique, but cannot be brought into connection with other people who've had parallel experiences that I fight against all the time. If there's one thing that should happen, it should be the amplification of empathy. That's what's important. Not the siloing of trauma. So that for me is profoundly important. And we were saying earlier today, two of my brothers, one has worked for 40 years in the Horn of Africa, working in Eritrea and Ethiopia and Somalia. And another of my brothers has worked he's young, he's only 30 years, in Georgia and Armenia. And we talk about this stuff, which is that, you have extraordinarily deep experiences of conflict in particular places, but how do you bring those experiences back into the world and find a tenor in conversation that makes it possible? How do you do it? It's at the heart of so much. And I'm answering your question just in a long-winded way, because that's about memory.
Yeah. I feel at times, I was listening and I was thinking, it kind of reminds me of Borges and his perfect library, because there is an element of your trying to get it all onto the shelves and ensure that it's all accessible and all of it is available to everyone. I mean, you're kind of at war with loss here.
I am at war with loss. I mean, there's a sort of there's sort of systole and diastole, sort of breathing in and breathing out, because there's this absolutely foundational thing for me, which is about sitting at my wheel, listening to the French suites or the Goldberg variations or David Lang or someone, and making pots. And that's about connecting
with myself and my breath, and connecting to the fact that Homo faber, that objects have always been made. The first objects in the world are vessels. And that I'm going to make these, and I'm going to put them out in the world, and they're going to be handed on, and then they're going to be broken. And that's completely fine. So there's that foundational thing, which is both a private act, but it's also a liminal act. It's on the threshold of letting something go. And then the writing, which feels so close to me as the same act, but seems to go out into the world in a very different way. I can't remember what you were asking me. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I have no idea.
That's okay. The riffing's just
so
fine.
tired.
So I'm curious.
Yeah.
So this may sound trivial, and it probably is, but do any of your artistic colleagues say, "Would you just stop writing and just focus on the ceramics, or would you just stop doing the ceramics and focus on the writing? Because you're kind of ruining the neighborhood."
Well, actually, what it allows is literary critics to say he's a really shit writer, but at least he makes pots. and the art critics say he's not really an artist, but some of his books are all right. So I get it both ways.
And who wouldn't want to have twice as much criticism and misery, right?
Exactly. Bring it on.
Yeah. So the phrase vessels keeps coming up.
Yeah.
And I'm curious because you have all these different Jewish references, and yet the one you don't mention is all about the vessels, which is Kabbalah, and about the breaking of the vessels and the fundamental nature of a broken world. I take it that's important to you.
It has crossed my mind. Yeah, wait for the next book. But that's not online, is it? We're not relaying this out of the room, are we? By any chance?
We are.
Oh, damn. Okay.
We are.
But the relationship of the vessel. There is at the heart. There is something extraordinarily powerful. It's a very powerful embodied image of the body and the pot. We talk about the body of the pot. And even sometimes use the language of a shoulder and the lip of a pot, and the belly of a pot and the foot of the pot. But there's also this extraordinary history, and I would please come tomorrow to Potsdamer Platz, if you can. Also come on, actually, big invitation on Saturday at 11 when I'm reading poetry, not my own poetry, all the poetry that matters to me. It's a lock-in from 11 o'clock. So come. But the
it's a lock-in, but not a larkin, right? I couldn't tell.
That's the worst pun. I think
I'm so glad I've done something distinctive.
Now I know. But the body and the vessel, and actually there's also this hugely significant thing about inhumation, which is the burying of ashes or the burying of people actually within vessels, and so it's the beginning of life and the end of life, and there's nothing melancholic about this remotely. This isn't melancholic stuff. This is to be talked about. There's Freud's essay Mourning and Melancholia, and it's melancholia is the refusal to grieve properly. It's to holding on to something that you can't let go of, and then there's grieving, which sort of allows you to make a different kind of space. Both of those are really interesting poles, and within these vessels, I think there's mourning and there's melancholia, and probably Freud as well, actually, which I hadn't thought about.
Well, one last question, and probably also inappropriate, but I have to ask. You have these brothers who are also focused on terrible crimes against people. You have this enormous burden of the past that you need to work through, and you have this extraordinary vocabulary having to do lexicon having to do with continental Europe and Judaism and the 19th century and so on. And you grew up in Canterbury. And I'm kind of wondering what it was like around the de Waal dinner table that got you all to this place, because they don't naturally go together. Can you just give us a peek?
So I grew up in Canterbury, and my friend Tacita here also grew up in Canterbury. Kind of wonderful interstices between us, gaps, and connections. I grew up in Canterbury because my father, who's half Jewish, converted and became the Dean of Canterbury. A Jewish boy becomes the Dean of Canterbury. It's kind of, and no one would know except he has a strong Viennese accent. So there he is. And we grew up in the deanery, which is this beautiful, huge medieval house with spiral staircases and a chapel and 20 bedrooms. And, you know, it's an extraordinary place. And also portraits of the deans going back to 1560. So since 1560, the Reformation, there are portraits of the deans, some of them by... So my father, this is all apropos of this, my father, when he becomes dean, is told by the archbishop that he has to have his portrait painted. So he says, okay, I know who I'll ask. I'll ask my cousin, Marie-Louise von Montesquieu. She's a great poet. She's pupil of Beckmann, Viennese, lives in exile in London, Hampstead, like they all do. And she'll paint me. And so he goes off and he gets painted by Marie-Louise, who's known him since he was a boy. And it's unveiled with the Archbishop and the Mayor of Canterbury there, probably your father there, and it's unveiled, and she hasn't allowed him to see the portrait. So we're there in the drawing room, huge room, bigger than this, and she's painted him as a rabbi. So it kind of pretty extraordinary moment. And, you know, so the household is full of people. The household, my parents had an open door, so there were lots of writers and people of all faiths coming through the door. And from early on, we were told that, you know, you do not know who's going to be there at lunchtime. You do not know who's going to be there. You sit and you talk. So that was our upbringing. And, you know, and Marie-Louise von Montesquieu's portrait was hanging there in the middle of the house as a kind of complex icon of, you know, where do you belong?
She was invited back?
She was invited back.
I could ask a million more questions, but I think there are probably 5 million in the audience. So what's...
There might not be anyone, in which case wine and water and sunshine is outside.
Why don't we start right up here? I would just ask that you wait for the microphone. Great. Thank you. No.
Okay, thank you very much for this really wonderful talk. I have one question. You've talked a lot about loss and memory, and you talked a little bit in the lecture that you gave, and the idea of dialogue came up in the discussion, and I wanted to take you up a little bit more on this idea of dialogue, because the exhibitions that I saw of your work often, to me, immediately brought up the idea of dialogue. So you placing objects to get into dialogue with other objects that are in the room, and the meaning that is being created for the viewers is through seeing this, you know, after the object had moved there,
yes.
Seeing this conversation, and the conversation may be different, and the same objects may mean something different in a different surrounding. And I found it really interesting now when you talked about the exhibition in the Musée Camondo, where I, for the first time now that you say it, realized that you're actually doing these letters and the broken letters as a kind of memorial to what was there and wasn't there any longer. Yeah. Whereas when I went there, I had also this idea of the dialogue with the art objects in the museum. So I was just wondering whether you could say a little bit more about this idea of dialogue, which
well, I mean, you can. How can I not be in dialogue? I mean, so the things that I make and the way I put them down in the world. You know, it's a line from the Heaven Rise. I take an object from my pocket, I put it down in front of me, and I begin to tell a story. So it's in that sense, you know, not necessarily a narrative, but a kind of a kind of energy field changes as soon as you put something down in the world. So either in sight sensitive work, you know, whether Camondo or the Frick or whatever, that's one kind of work. But actually, you know, there's a different kind of thing, which is working with the vitrine, as well. I mean, the work which I put within a structure where things don't move, for me, they are still in motion, which sounds strange, but when I see them, for me, that becomes music or poetry. It becomes something that I hear or wants to take me into a different place. So actually, in the New Berlin exhibition, I've made my first room. It's a room, I've made objects you can touch, and I've made, you can't move them because they weigh about 700 kilos each, but I've also made a room where you can sit and look at things, and it's a room made out of burnt oak. It smells absolutely wonderful, and it's a sort of quiet space to think about the conversation between objects and memory and people. So you're welcome.
We actually have a great question from one of the viewers who says, "Thank you for this touching and deep reflection upon memory. Is there a place for your Odessa, Ukraine part of family history in current or future work or projects, and how do current events there penetrate your work?"
Well, they of course they penetrate my work. I mean, most deeply, I have to say, for my youngest brother, who's lived in Odessa and has many friends there, including scholars and poets there. So I hear about that. I have no immediate plans to make anything more around Odessa, but it's very much part of my life. It's very much part of, and actually, of course, I'm Celan, of course, was born in Berdichev. So however you navigate this, you're endlessly conscious of this conflict.
Okay, more questions right here, Norma.
Well, first of all, I was deeply moved by all the things that you've been saying tonight and also what you have shown us. And my personal question was, you were talking about that the vessels are like a breath, that there is air in it. And then you were comparing them to human beings. And actually in the choreography that you showed us, you also put them in movement into and you even said before, to save them in a way.
Yeah.
So how does that go together with the idea that if they're broken, it's also okay? It's like a different,
Well,
I'd like to know a little bit more about that part.
Well, I mean, there's sort of intentional breakage, and then there's life, and we're endlessly encountering, we endlessly encounter not only within our immediate lives and those of people we love, but encountering people whose lives are broken, the raggedness of and fracture of people's lives. And there is there is this somatic, bodily connection between the discovery of the broken object in the world and this awareness of loss, this awareness of a wholeness which has disappeared. So it's not. There's nothing straightforward about this at all. There really isn't. But the choreography of the Psalms, where people are moving in and out of spaces, being held, coming together, and then being separated, for me is very strongly, very, very, very profoundly close to my understanding of how I move vessels around in the world. So, sometimes you need to break something as well to let it go. So that's different. That's not about other people, it's about myself. You need to break something. And I also, just on that, no, another time. Another lecture. Another lecture.
Questions? Wonderful. Finally, someone in the back.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't be very original by saying that this has been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned Paul Celan and Jean Améry. It doesn't come as a surprise that both of them committed suicide.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, how have you approached that reality in your work as a writer, as an artist? You mentioned kintsugi. You've just mentioned that sometimes things need to be broken to be let go of. So how are you aware of that? Is there something that has driven you? Or I asked the same question to Anselm Kiefer, for whom Paul Celan plays a central part, and he paused and he said, he showed me a painting of his, and he said, "I think that's the answer."
I will follow Kiefer. I will follow Kiefer. Kiefer's right to say that there are some things which you have already expressed elsewhere, and I respect that as an answer. I think on something which is so profoundly personal, I will actually, let that go. But I will also say, read the last chapter, if you would, of my Camondo book, which is about the failure of my work, the failure of memorial, that you try and do something to encompass any of this loss, level of loss, this landscape of loss, and you know that you need to do it, and you also know how profoundly you fail to do it, and then you have to get up and you have to try again, which is Kiefer. Kiefer talks about this entirely. He talks about stuttering, about returning to something because you can't finish it, and in that sense, that's something where he and I are in great alignment.
Samuel Beckett as well.
And Beckett, fail again.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Ruth.
Wait for the microphone. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, do you think you are ever going to break free of your past in the way that your father did by converting, not only converting, but also becoming a priest, or your uncle moving to Japan and taking that kind of radical move, or even your brothers leaving the UK and living in different countries? Do you think there might come a time where you'll say, enough of this, I want to focus on something completely new and uncharted territory for me?
Goodness. That's quite some question, Ruth. Breaking free of the past. I don't know. I'm not sure whether, for me, I'm not sure whether the pull back to try and understand something is something that has closure. I mean, it's that Jean Amory thing for me, which is so extraordinary about in some ways that you can't stop being a witness if you're a witness. You can't close the book. And I think I'm not bigging myself up here. I'm just saying it like it is. That in some way I'm not sure what closure or separation would look like. Perhaps I have to convert and become a rabbi. I mean, come on. I mean, that's something. But I mean, it's an idea. But I
think you're well down the road on the curriculum. Yeah.
I'll let you know.
So we have a question from a really distinguished classicist, but because of the strictures of German privacy law, I can't name the scholar's name, but I will read her question. Your pots are distinguished by their blankness, no image, no ornament. As a classicist who is deeply engaged with the achievements of ancient Greek painted pottery, has this tradition impacted you in any way?
Well, I would like to say to the great nameless classicist that I love black figure and red figure the wonderful, extraordinary narrative animation of all these myths that matter to us so much. The bit that I would say back to her is that the bit of Greek ceramics that matter most are ostraka, which are the broken bits of Greek pottery on which you used to write names and combinations and curses. Those are the things that matter most to me. So text on pots, absolutely yes. But you won't catch me painting Hecuba on a pot soon. I'm desperately interested to see who she is. Oh, well, I'm honoured by the question.
But again,
Thank you so much. Ostraka, let's have the conversation. I'm talking to the camera there.
again, shards of vessels.
Yeah.
So, okay, I saw another hand back. Oh, what, right here.
You're a fantastically complicated audience. I mean, these are really searching questions.
I am curious because I believe you were raised as a Christian, but you had to immerse yourself in Judaism for all this research. So did you have to research that a lot as an adult, or had you been brought up with enough?
That's an interesting question. There's a certain amount of Judaism within my upbringing, the whole of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The Old Testament, as it was called, in my upbringing. So, no, I mean, it was a pretty wide-ranging childhood, in the sense that, though we grew up in Canterbury and with all that extraordinary liturgy of the Christian faith, there were rabbis, in Canterbury, and who were great friends, and my grandmother used to talk, even though she also had strong Christian faith, used to talk about Judaism, and Iggy absolutely did in old age. It was extraordinarily powerful. This last year, before he died, when I was with him a lot in Tokyo, would talk a lot about his secular Jewish upbringing in Vienna. So I didn't have to work up very much in terms of knowledge, but I seem to hang around quite a lot of Jewish people since. Yeah.
Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. You seem to me to be very sensitive and very sensual. And I just want to know, how were you able to divide the collection of the Netzkes? I think about 170 or 172 you gave to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. And the other part you gave to an auction house.
Yep.
How were you able to decide?
So it was it was a very, very, very proud and wonderful part of our family life. It was during the first Syrian refugee crisis. And we decided that collectively, the children and my father, that it was seeing the sheer amount of suffering of that first extraordinary year of the crisis, that we would do two things simultaneously. One was to put on a long-term loan to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, which is the greatest part of the collection, and these are the masterpieces. And the other part we would sell, and we made a huge amount of money. So they've gone back into the world in this diasporic way for the refugees. So it was an interesting an interesting thing to do. And some people criticized it. They said, how can you possibly, do this with the collection? And I was thinking so much about my grandmother, so much about Iggy, so much about my great-grandfather, and thinking that they were people of such generosity that this was entirely in their honour. So it was a beautiful family thing to do. I'm very proud of it.
No, it's deeply impressive. As impressive as the donation of the books to Mosul was as well. I have to ask, are there any boring people in your family? You don't have to name names.
I'm now incredibly conscious of the live element of the Zoom. Blimey, Daniel, that is quite some question. Yes, is the answer, but I'm not going to say that out loud.
Okay. Well, it's just for the rest of us reassuring, after all. One last question. All the way in the back, over there on the other side of the Wannsee.
It's quite a question to ask.
Hi. I was wondering.
Could you stand up so I can see who you are?
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. I was wondering. So your work is obviously very physical, material. I'm wondering how you think about immaterial things like prayer, ritual, that maybe within Judaism or outside of Judaism that has to do with things that don't have a physical form, and how you think about that. Yeah.
I think about it a lot, but you see, that's because I'm also write, and words become sound, and they go out there into the world. So, and there's an awful lot of repetition and ritual in my own work. There's a lot of connection between in many things that are from my upbringing, the monastic hours, this wonderful way of charting a day through different prayers, or the way that the Psalms work with it, both within a month and then a year. So all of that is there and present for me. So there's a lot of music and a lot of sound, and of course a lot of words happen. So I just happen to make pots as well.
Well, this has been an incredible evening, and one of the most enjoyable that we've had, and enlightening and mind expanding in the best possible way that we've had. And so I can't thank you enough, Edmund, for coming. And I also want to thank, even though she's not here, Marina Kellen-French, both for making this visitorship, but also for putting us in touch, because she's a huge admirer of your work, and it was great that she put us together. I hope that we'll get the other two visits from Edmund de Waal that I mentioned earlier. But I'm not going to press you on that right now. That would be somehow not on. So, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. This has been a great end to a terrific semester, and I certainly hope you'll all be back in place in September. This is our last in-person event. We will be doing a Zoom event next week. It seems like an anticlimax to bring up the presidential election, but I do have to mention these things. So part of our Road to the Election 2024 series, The Crossroads of Democracy, Student Protest, and the 2024 U.S. election, we'll be talking to a truly outstanding student journalist named Theo Baker, a great social scientist named Nicholas Christakis, and pollster Laura Silver. That is Tuesday, the 18th at 5 p.m. If you're looking for more intellectual, artistic, and cultural sustenance, go to Edmund's exhibition at the Gallery Max Hetzler, Potsdamer Straße 77 to 87. And beginning tomorrow, that exhibition is open. Now, I hope you'll all please join us for continued conversation outside and on the terrace where it's still light. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.